Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the Psy-Fi series, discovering the cutting-edge science and research in psychedelic medicine.
Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting episode of the Psy-Fi podcast, where we talk to leading industry experts, clinicians, scientists, and researchers to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. Today, I'm joined by a wonderful guest, Dr. Theodore Bender of UnityPoint. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Bender. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It would be really awesome if you could, we had a really great discussion last time that we talked. If you could share a little bit about yourself and what you do with our audience before we get started, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I'm happy to. I am currently the president of UnityPlace, which is the behavioral health and substance use disorder division of UnityPoint Health in Central Illinois. I came to Peoria, Illinois here about a year ago to take over leadership of a newly formed merger, which is UnityPlace. UnityPlace was the merger of three just storied franchises here in Central Illinois. The Tazwood Center for Wellness, the Human Service Center, and the UnityPoint Health Behavioral Health Division, which is comprised of psychiatry, testing, inpatient residential facilities, inpatient psychiatric units, and some outpatient units. So the merger of these three great entities was very big news. I heard of it even before I was considered for the position when I was in Texas. And it really the mission is really to deliver the most comprehensive, integrated community and medical behavioral healthcare system around. We have a vision of creating a national model here that we can kind of create a blueprint and give to the rest of the country. We know that there are significant gaps in care, in mental health care and substance use disorder treatment. And our goal here is to integrate these three great resources into a seamless transition from one stage to the next, while optimizing outcomes and reducing, emergency department and inpatient admissions as much as possible.
That's really fascinating. You're at the forefront of such, an important epidemic right now between mental health and the opioid crisis and the pandemic. I think the work you're doing right now is so incredibly important. If you could just take a second to, talk a little bit about what that's been like for you in the last 6 months or throughout this, crazy year of 2020 and how that's kind of impacted your work.
Yeah, I kind of joke around with my staff sometimes and tell them, if you ever long in the future are looking for another job or interviewing with another facility, if they ever ask you the age-old question, tell me a time where you had to manage through diversity or difficulty, we're all going to have a fantastic answer.
That's so true, man.
This pandemic has been the most challenging point in my career, and I would venture to say for many managers in many different fields, not just medical, they could probably say the same. It's a difficult time in many ways because we're seeing just huge spikes in mental health disorders, substance use disorders, related disorders, overdose deaths, and I'm really worried about potential spikes in suicide, although we might not see that for several years to come after the pandemic. But one thing's for sure, the rate of diagnosable mental health conditions in the United States is skyrocketing, especially around the disorders like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. We've hit a point where we've literally created the most toxic possible recipe for mental health and substance use disorders. The pandemic has caused such an increase in fear, isolation, and economic downturn. Adding all three of those together is just a recipe for disaster in mental health and substance use disorders. Certainly, our company here in Central Illinois, a nonprofit, large mental health and substance use treatment company, is seen significant increases in demand. In fact, one of my biggest struggles right now is just hiring as fast as I can to keep pace. it's a good problem to have in business, but it's still a problem.
Right.
And luckily we are getting a tremendous amount of applications, and there are people out there that are looking to get into this business, which is great, because having the opposite problem there would be really scary. But the demand for services has gone up so fast that, it's making our heads spin. That being said, we are more efficient, more productive, and have done excellent work in integrating the three agencies to develop processes to streamline and to really care for and get patients into treatment who really need it.
Oh man, yeah, that's really intense and really important work that you're doing right now. It'd be really interesting, before we dive more into, there's so much I want to talk about based on what you just said, but if you could give me a little insight into what led you to practice the type of medicine that you do today, and what inspired you to work with mental health and addiction and, these very pressing issues that we have in our society today.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's interesting how careers tend to go. You kind of start off thinking one thing and you end up in a completely different place a lot. And that certainly has been the case for me. I remember being an undergrad at Florida State University. I think I changed my major 3, 4, 5, 9 times. And I got to my junior year and I took a course in psychology, intro to psychology, something like that. And as my mind was at the time, I really wasn't paying too much attention. I really wasn't that motivated. But we got to chapter 2, and it was all about the human brain. And just learning the basic things about the human brain, I was instantly fascinated. Like, I had no idea that the brain was sitting in liquid, firing off billions of electrical impulses every millisecond. I had no idea that was going on inside my own head, and everybody else's.
Yeah.
I became really fascinated with that aspect of neuroscience. So I continued taking psychology classes, and I originally wanted to be a neuropsychologist, and I started working in laboratories, and even as an undergrad, got these great experiences where I was able to do, I was able to learn a process called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, which is basically taking a small amount of cells from inside the cheek and multiplying them, millions and billions of times, so you could actually see variations in genetic structure. And I even was able to get a publication as an undergraduate. So I knew I wanted to continue my education. And literally right at the end of my undergrad career, I suddenly just changed my mind and decided I wanted to work with patients directly. And my neuroscience advisor was like, okay, well, this seems pretty sudden considering all of your work has been in neuroscience. Are you sure? And I was like, yes, I'm absolutely sure. So there I am in graduate school in a clinical psychology program, not neuroscience. And I did continue some of that work I was doing, but my interests really shifted from serotonin transporter genes over to suicide. And I became really fascinated with really one aspect of suicide. That's what most of my publications center around, which is this notion of an acquired ability for suicide. There's so many myths around suicide, you probably heard before. Many people have heard a lot of the myths and believe them to be true. But one of the myths that I knew was false was that suicide is the easy way out. You've probably heard people say that before. Many people have said that. People, will hear about a suicide and say how selfish it was and they just took the easy way out. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I knew that, but how do you scientifically validate that? And the main component that I was working off was this acquired ability for suicide. Now there's 3 main components for suicide that are necessary for one to make a serious attempt or to die by suicide. And those 3 components are combined together as desire and ability. So the desire piece has 2 components: thwarted belongingness and a perceived burdensomeness on others. So you don't feel like you belong anywhere, you feel ostracized, whether or not you really are. And you also really do believe that you're a burden on others, your family, your friends, and they would just be better off if you were gone. So it's more common for people to have the desire, but it's a lot less common for people to acquire the ability to do so. So I got really interested in that one piece of it, the ability. And I started thinking, which patient populations or populations could you really look at that? And, and who acquires this ability? Whether or not they're suicidal, you can have the acquired capability, but not the desire. So who would get to that point and how? So my research really started to focus on that. And eventually it led me to the military. As you can imagine, they go through a lot of fear and threats and exposure that may increase one's ability to die by suicide if, in fact, that was something that they wanted to do. They're exposed to weapons, to combat, to many other experiences. And that led into becoming part of a very large grant known as the Military Suicide Research Consortium. And our initial round of funding was around $35 million for 5 years. And then that project was extended for another 5 years after. And it's still going on today. And there's been a ton of publications that have come out around that. And it's all focused on warrior resiliency in the military and preventing suicide. So through that work, I also did a 4-year postdoc in that field as I was working in substance use as well. Through that work, especially on my residency, I started working with veterans who were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and almost every single one of them had a substance use disorder. So in doing the actual individual treatment, I started becoming much more interested in the substance use disorder piece. And then again, in the same tradition of my kind of changing my mind at the last second type response that I was becoming known for, when I was finishing my residency, I had battled with this for years and years about what I was going to do, going into, academia and continuing my publication work and research, or going into practice. And I remember I had a conversation with my advisor at the time. I was 3 months away from finishing and having my PhD. And I just said, I've been struggling with this for years and I don't know what to do. And she said, just follow your heart. Do what you want to do, what makes you happy. So I did, and I felt relieved when she said that, and I applied for a job in South Florida because that's where I wanted to go back to. My family was from there. And it was the first job I applied to was a therapist at a substance use disorder treatment facility. And I got the interview, I got the job, and my goal was just to be a therapist and see patients, and I was really happy doing that. About 6 months into that, they asked me to be a program director, and I said no, because I was happy doing what I was doing. They were pretty relentless. I finally caved. Now fast forward 8 years and I'm, in management and running large companies, which I've been doing now for the last 6 or 7 years.
Wow, what a story. That's really fascinating. I can totally relate to, ending up somewhere in my career as well that I totally didn't expect when I started, and it's been quite a journey. I've been really grateful for it. And, part of what I love is being able to connect with people like you and, talk about these issues. And, you brought up so many interesting things that intersect with psychedelic medicine, from your story about PCR. I don't know if you know the way it was first conceived, the idea to take the DNA and to heat it up and separate the strands and then cool it back down to amplify it was actually the guy was in California, I believe, and I think he was on mushrooms, and he was now I absolutely do not condone driving on psychedelics. I believe he was driving and looking in the rearview mirror, and he was seeing the trees kind of come together and then unzip themselves basically, and then spiral around and then come back together again. And he was like, oh, what if we could do that to DNA, and that's sort of how PCR, one of the most revolutionary innovations in biology, came to be. But yeah, no, focusing a little bit more on, what we're here to talk about today, psychedelic medicine. I think it's so powerful. The clinical research that has gone into it, and we talk about things like suicide, the utility of drugs like psilocybin and ketamine. Ketamine in particular has shown a lot of efficacy in treating acute suicidality in the research lately. I think there's a lot of relevant topics, so I'd love to just get your broad strokes opinion on this new wave of medicine that's coming into the fold and reintegrating into modern pharmacopoeia, and just what your thoughts are on it in general.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And that story you mentioned about how PCR was visualized, now that you mentioned it, I do remember reading that a long time ago. I had forgotten that, but you're absolutely right. That's how it was originated. And it's been an incredibly important piece of biology and chemistry for a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's a great question. And it reminds me of going back into my graduate school days. And, before I was kind of classically trained as a scientist, and we all have biases, but I wasn't as good at being objective in spite of data and evidence against my own emotional attachments or feelings. You develop that over time. The good ones do. So I remember being back in graduate school, and we were studying for our comprehensive exams, which is usually around the second or third year of grad school. And as you can imagine, it's on a very wide range of topics, and we had study groups, and we had to read like 150 scientific papers and be able to answer questions about this and synthesize all that information. And at the time, I was reading about medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, and it was some work called harm reduction that was coming out of Nova Southeastern University in South Florida. And the work, I believe, was done by a pretty famous couple in the field, the Sobels. They're also known for a very important statistical analysis and regression. So I was reading this information, and it's early again, and my biases were stronger back then. And I'm reading the data of this paper, and it's showing efficacy for harm reduction over just pure abstinence for drug use. And at the time, this is probably 2005, 2006. Which is not that long ago, but if you walked into a treatment center or an AA meeting and you tried to spout, the benefits of harm reduction over abstinence only models, people would laugh you out of the room. Right. It's been, even now, these life-saving drugs are only offered at, I think I read, about a third of drug treatment facilities in this country. So even now, still a very heavy bias towards the evidence and the data. But if you read the evidence and the data now, especially on medication-assisted therapies like Suboxone or Methadone or drugs like that, it reduces the mortality rate by half. And that's been shown again and again. And it's very clear what the data is on this. So what else do you really need? We're in the middle of one of the worst overdose epidemics this country has ever seen. In fact, it is the worst it's ever been. And this year, I imagine, is going to be way worse than last year, which was the worst year. So if we have medications and tools in our toolkit that save lives, why aren't they more widespread used? Going back to graduate school, when I was reading this information, my immediate response in my mind was, this is garbage. And I literally threw the papers away. Now, going back, that was really dumb. But that was kind of the thinking at the time, and even now to some degree. But the point of that is to show that when it comes to psilocybin and psychedelics and ketamine, it would be remiss of me or anyone to just dismiss these potential treatment modules just because it doesn't sound good, or we're just using drugs to treat drug addiction. It would be a really big mistake for scientists or people in this field to just dismiss it. So I learned that the hard way, and I'm glad I did, because now we have this new potential treatment on the forefront, which is, the psychedelics and ketamine and these types of drugs. And even though it's very, very early in the research, and especially with, large scale clinical trials, there is a lot of promise, and the data is pretty good in a lot of different situations. Now, I have concerns, definite concerns, and I definitely want to see more well-controlled science, bigger trials, more participants. But overall, some of these potential treatments could be game-changing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and when it comes to really serious things like treatment-resistant depression, alcoholism, and addiction, the studies that we sparked in the early 60s and 70s, we're circling back to that now, and the research is even more profound and even more groundbreaking now, and we're really performing some really high quality trials. I was just writing a blog actually on professional. So we're launching a new series for Microdose called Psychedelics and our first one is Psychedelics and Sports. So we're talking to some professional athletes, and it's really interesting seeing the intersection of, for example, psychedelics and sports, because one very important application, I think, is the management of pain, for example. Obviously the widespread use of opioids and the overprescription of opioids has serious ramifications, and it's really important to note that there was recently a double-blind randomized controlled trial that showed microdosing LSD was paramount to, I believe it was 20 milligrams of oxycodone. So not just placebo. And then even more interesting when it comes to ketamine is Dr. Becker and the team at Bexon have found that people that receive ketamine in the post-operative pain management phase are less likely to have that pain graduate to chronic pain, which that becomes a whole new and much more difficult thing to then battle versus severe acute pain for a limited amount of time. And it has to do with the way that these cells, because the cells in our body are actually able to have a memory, so to speak, of pain. And so what the NMDA receptor antagonist that is ketamine does is it disrupts that memory that these cells essentially form about the pain, so they're less likely to go and become chronic pain patients after. And so I think that's just really fascinating. I remember I did a podcast some years ago with Eugene Monroe, the former left tackle for the Ravens, and he was talking about he's one of the first football players to advocate for medical cannabis, saying how much better it obviously is to the opioids that are running rampant right now in the NFL, because just think about how badly those players are getting beat up all the time. And then you have things like CTE and concussions and traumatic brain injury and all of that. And so there's a huge potential and promise that psychedelic medicines like these hold in really shifting the paradigm around pain management, around addiction, and around mental health. And I think a lot of our discussion today centers around, shifting our cultural understanding and paradigm around things like addiction. So I'd be interested to know from you how you've seen the space kind of evolve, both for the better and the worse, in the last, since you've been a part of it, what's changed amidst the opioid epidemic, new therapeutics, what are you excited about? It'd just be interesting to get your take on all of that.
Yeah, a great question. And kind of think generally, if answering the what am I excited about, the thing I'm excited about most, and I think we need, there's a tremendous amount of research that needs to be done to fully understand this. Because, even one example is like antidepressants. We still don't have a great idea of how antidepressants function in the brain. We don't, we know that they work, and sometimes you have to do a bunch of trial and error for the person, but they can be very effective to treat major depressive disorder, and they can be a cure for major depressive disorder, even if that's all you're doing. But we don't have a great understanding of all the mechanisms in the brain, how it even works. And with what we're talking about today, I'll tell you what was most exciting to me. So let's just say we've got to a point where we're using microdosing of whatever to treat major depressive disorder. Let's say that that's a mainstream treatment, which is definitely not right now, but it could be someday. The question, that you want to have is, if for the layperson out there who's thinking about this, well, what am I doing? Am I just taking LSD every day and that's treating my depression? That obviously cannot be the answer, because, there's concerns about, toxicity and other things like that. But if you can give someone a treatment for depression like this with a small amount of psilocybin or ketamine or whatever you're using, and then, like you were talking about, it has lasting effects on, structural change in the brain. That's what I'm most excited about, because that may be a few doses or whatever the treatment protocol is. And then it leads to, for example, a surge of glutamate, which activates AMPA receptors and creates downstream activity, which can result in neuroplastic changes, including things like synaptogenesis, for example, or, even more importantly, the formation of new neuronal pathways. Now, when you're doing treatment for depression like cognitive behavioral therapy, there's evidence to suggest that cognitive behavioral therapy creates new neuronal pathways, which is part of the reason why it works. Much like, learning how to ride a bike creates new neuronal pathways, or learning a new language. With continued and considerable practice, you can make positive changes in the brain. Now, if these drugs can do something similar, and especially faster, we're going to save a lot of lives, and we're going to improve the lives of a lot of people. Because, we were just talking about what the pandemic is doing to mental health. We're going to need some new tools in the toolbox to really kind of mitigate the damage that this pandemic is going to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and it's fascinating to see the robust toolkit that's coming, into fruition as far as psychedelic medicine goes and what we have available. I think a really important element that you brought up is that it's not just about, the medication in this context in particular. It's really important to include other elements such as diet and psychotherapy, and connecting people with each other. And so I think it'd be really interesting for you to just talk about what you think the clinical landscape will look like, both for the providers and the patients, as we integrate psychedelic therapy into maybe traditional rehabilitation, caregiving models.
Yeah, I think that the one, at least from what I can tell in the research and what I've heard kind of anecdotally, the drug that's mostly been kind of coming to a place of acceptance is the ketamine. And you've probably heard of that there are ketamine clinics going up across the country now. And I think that's probably one of the more accepted ones, at least within the, internal circles of people working in this business. And at UnityPlace, we're not ruling anything out in the future. We want to remain innovative, and we're going to continue to monitor the research and see what makes sense. So I'm most excited about the results of the ketamine trials and things I've seen so far, especially again with the evidence that they may form new neuronal pathways and create positive neuroplastic changes. I read an interesting article recently. Actually, I think it just came out. You may have heard of it. It's in the Journal of the American Medical Association of Psychiatry. They did a very carefully controlled, rigorous study for psychedelic treatment for major depression. It was 27 people, so again, the sample size is kind of low, but they showed a nearly 4 times greater effect in the treatment of depression than kind of standardized treatment. And what you mentioned too, which is also crucial, they received 2 doses of psilocybin on different days, and received about 11 hours of psychotherapy. So it wasn't just, here's some psilocybin, good luck. It was carefully dosed, carefully controlled, in combination with standardized treatment for depression therapy. So the results were really good. And again, it's a small study. You get away from just a small pilot and do larger scale. But again, if we found a way to significantly reduce depression fast and furious, we're going to save thousands of lives. So that's exciting. The one thing about studies like this that I think are also kind of hard to tease out, and it's going to take some really smart scientists out there to figure this piece out, is the experimental group here. They obviously knew that they were receiving psilocybin. Mm-hmm. You can't really double blind it. You know what I mean?
Right, of course.
Because even if you don't tell them, I think they're going to figure it out pretty quick.
Yeah, agreed. It's not like a traditional drug in that way. You're right.
Exactly. So one of the problems that they're going to have to deal with in the science is that expectancy effect. Almost like placebo. Almost like you're getting the drug, you're getting the experimental condition. Therefore, does that play into your symptom improvement? But we're getting to a point now where, again, this is a really well done study. And we saw, again, not just slight effects, but significant effects. So again, these are like the springboards or the foundation for, these larger clinical trials that I'm really waiting to see and I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's super fascinating to see the results that these trials have been showing. They've really been unearthing some really fascinating therapeutic benefits of psychedelics that you're right. They seem to be very long lasting, which is completely opposed to kind of our current approach, which is something that needs to be taken daily, such as methadone or maybe antidepressants. And I think that's really powerful and really novel, because I think it's an empowering thing for patients to feel like, I can go through this treatment and I can receive these therapies. And, I put in my 50% and my effort, and what I can get out of that is not, is maybe a life that was so much better than they could have imagined. And it's not subject to being, on liquid handcuffs, which is one way that methadone is often described. Not that those drugs maybe don't have a place, but it could be perhaps more short term. I know we're talking about opiate withdrawal now, so we should have discussions about something like iboga, ibogaine, and MindMed is currently developing 18-MC, which is a novel derivative of that. And so ibogaine is a psychedelic shrub from Africa, which has been shown to if not completely alleviate acute opiate withdrawal symptoms, get pretty close to it, and that's been a really remarkable sort of addition to the therapeutic toolkit that we've been utilizing in psychedelic medicine. And you're right. What's really interesting is I had this discussion with a doctor last night about how really this is not new medicine, and nor is the element of incorporating it with psychotherapy. Like, that's really what the indigenous cultures and tribes people that brought this medicine forward through all the years, that's how they were doing it. It was a very community-centric practice and tradition, to utilize these plant medicines in a very sacred and respectful way. And if someone in the community was suffering from depression or addiction, then the whole community would gather around them, and I think right now that's so important because people feel so isolated because of this pandemic, and I know people I've talked to say they've been struggling because, they're not going to meetings as often, for example, for the people that go to 12-step meetings. I know it's hard to get beds and stuff and detoxes before. And so it's definitely challenged us in a lot of ways, but it's super promising to see some of these results and these trials have come to light. And you're right, the sample sizes, while they may be small for these early trials, they're really robust because, they take the sample size into account when, evaluating the p-values and the statistics. And even still, they're getting such remarkable results and such significant findings. They definitely warrant greater research for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that.
So, considering the fact that psychedelic drugs have been grouped into the same category of illicit narcotic substances, such as heroin or methamphetamine, cocaine, especially because of the way that, the Controlled Substances Act and the way that these compounds are scheduled, a lot of people kind of lump all these drugs together in one place. And that's sort of the motif or the message that's been traditionally used in your, more common detox or rehab program. So how will that paradigm shift in your mind occur to where we take some of these substances that have indeed shown such promise in research? How can we remove the taboo and the idea that, we might be risking someone's sobriety or their chance of recovery by giving them a psychoactive compound like this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. In much the way that I believe the medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder is making progress in that same domain. From my perspective, it's two pieces. One, you continue to develop the science. You get the scientific community to really understand the potential benefits over potential harms. You keep doing these studies, keep building on the extant research while taking it further for trying to treat other disorders. You keep building that body of research under really good controlled conditions. And especially that report I was just telling you about that came out of JAMA, which is a highly respected journal,
Right.
And I believe the researchers were from Johns Hopkins and Ohio State University. So really highly respected journals, really highly respected research departments. More and more that this happens, I believe over time people will start to come around. I mean, we have to, because if you look at suicides, for example, suicide rates are higher than they've ever been in this country. It has been escalating and escalating and escalating at rates that we've never seen before the pandemic started. Now, we don't know that the pandemic is going to increase suicide deaths. We don't know that. If I had to guess, I would say yes, but will there be a statistically significant difference of what it would have been anyway before the pandemic, if the pandemic hadn't come? I don't know if the pandemic's going to cause more suicide. It'll be years before we really figure that out. My guess would be, yeah. There's evidence from the SARS pandemic many years ago, 20 years ago, roughly, where they did see some increased risk of suicide in certain age categories. But one thing we do know is that almost every single person that dies by suicide had a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. I think the number is 90%, and I bet you it's higher. So if that's the case, what is the question? How do we reduce and reverse the trend of suicide deaths? Is it going to be continued treatment, what we've been doing, status quo? Yeah, it can work. But how many people that died by suicide did never receive treatment? A lot, right. Probably half. So how are we going to engage the unengaged is one of the biggest questions. And will it be easier to engage the unengaged if we can offer faster, more effective treatments? And that's really where the promise lies here. We talk about a quick fix, and sometimes these things aren't a quick fix. But what if we can do, 2 or 3 sessions of, these type of treatments as the science progresses, in combination with some form of, mental health therapeutic treatment, and see results faster. So maybe you still need 11 to 15 sessions to treat your major depressive disorder with a therapist, but we get you started on the medication side, in the first session or 2, and your symptoms reduce 50% in a week or 2. That's, again, goes back to the game-changing aspect. And if that turns out to remain, or if the science continues to support that or show that this is what's happening, again, with low levels of, side effects, toxicity, addiction issues, then, I think that it'll become more and more accepted as we go. But, we're still going to fight the stigma. We're still going to fight, the AA, NA mentality of, sobriety is the only way. But if we can show success and we can save lives and we can advance the extant literature and it continues to prove fruitful and positive, then that's going to go a long way to getting people on board with this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And what's so interesting is that we need to, a lot of these psychedelic and plant medicines have shown us that there is a need to change our definition of how we measure success for an addict, for example. Depending on how these studies are done, oftentimes if it's not complete abstinence or full sobriety, then that person is categorized and statistically looked at as maybe having failed, when in fact, if they're still employing harm reduction practices, maybe not going back to IV use, or maybe socially drinking, or not everyone, that doesn't fit everyone's character, it doesn't work for everybody, but it's still important to reevaluate our measures for what success really looks like, and understand that it's a continuum, and it's something that definitely needs to be addressed and worked on over a consistent basis throughout someone's lifetime, and I think what's really fascinating about the rapidity of how fast that these drugs work, and how efficacious they're showing to be in clinical trials, and the fact that they do, people do take them recreationally. I bring that up only because whatever it takes to get the addict through the door to treatment, right? I think you can understand that, being in the position you're in, whatever it is that allures you and entices you to leave that life that of being an active addiction behind, I think that's great. If it gets you through those doors and you're willing to make an effort to change. And I think what psychedelic medicine has kind of offered us this opportunity to maybe get people excited. Maybe they don't have to wait maybe excited is a strong word, but they don't have to wait until things are absolute, it's an absolute travesty to be like, okay, I'm ready to give up and go to treatment, especially because the margin of error is just getting infinitely smaller as the days go by with how powerful the drugs are on the street. It's not like the old days where, every relapse can easily be your last, even if you're just, even if you're not shooting heroin anymore. It's just because that fentanyl is finding its way into everything, pressed pills, cocaine. People are unknowingly consuming this and dying left and right. And that's a really scary thing, So I think it's an important point to mention that, like, if someone that's struggling with substance use disorder, if they get excited or are interested or maybe find it appealing that maybe psychedelics are a part of their path forward to recovery, that's okay. I think a lot of the way that the AA and NA 12-step full abstinence mentality has kind of made a lot of feelings of like, or conjured or facilitate a lot of things of like guilt or shame around the need to use anything at all, like MAT, and so this next step in how we're using medications and drugs to manage this condition, I think can really benefit from conversations like this, and helping really dismantle the taboo and dismantle kind of the social beliefs and limiting beliefs around all of this. And so I think that's really an interesting point that you bring up.
Yeah, and a couple of things that you just mentioned that I think are also very interesting is, the stigma around addiction will remain for a long time, and mental health too. And there's this kind of stigma or feeling that if you're addicted to some substance, going through the withdrawal phase, even if you're in a detox center, that's just kind of part of what you have to go through. You have to suffer and go through all those difficulties in order to get to a place where you're going to maintain sobriety. I've never bought into that. I mean, it's like saying someone with cancer has to suffer through the chemo in order to get to a place where they're going to be able to maintain, what's the word I'm looking for? Remission with cancer. That doesn't make any sense. Although they do go through a difficult time, doctors do everything they can to provide comfort and to mitigate that. So saying someone's got to go through all the detox to suffer through that seems ridiculous to me. So if there is a way to ease that transition from active using, get through the withdrawal safely, of course. The second thing you mentioned too is this kind of notion of rock bottom. And like you said, maybe many years ago, 10, 20, 30 years ago, you could use a lot more without the risk, as severe a risk of overdosing and dying. But you're right, it's not just IV opioids anymore. It's repressed pills on the street, which are laced with fentanyl and cartenofil and all these other ones that are coming out. It's other drugs. We're finding fentanyl in cocaine. We're finding it in repressed benzodiazepines. The overdose death rate has spiked in other drug categories that weren't necessarily known for being a big risk for overdose death and one-time use. So that notion of you have to hit rock bottom is antiquated, because now you can dig a tiny little hole, maybe just one shovelful of earth, and that could be your last time because it can kill you just like that. So if we can figure out ways to get to the point where we can reduce the effects of withdrawal quickly and use different types of treatment methods that help maintain abstinence quicker and longer, all the better.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, about that. It's not like we need to go through and experience the physical torture of withdrawal, because if you ask any addict, that memory fades. It's not like that memory of going through withdrawal is going to keep you from using the next time. There needs to be a spiritual program or some sort of transformation that takes place to where you're seeking and wanting something else out of life, because you definitely cannot rest on the fact that, I went through this horrible detox, so I'm not going to go back again. It just doesn't work like that. So since we know that to be the case, if we can remove or at least alleviate a large portion of that misery, then people would likely be a lot more willing and eager to get into treatment and get better to begin with.
Yeah, and really in the treatment industry, especially in the for-profit side of that business, the whole business is getting patients. If you're a treatment facility and you have 80 beds and you're operating consistently at 30 beds, you're not going to last very long.
Right.
So the whole business is getting patients into treatment, and the fight, and I've worked on that side of the business for a long time, the fight is getting them in and getting them to commit and getting them to come to treatment. And that's what that show Intervention is all about, right? You've probably seen it, and you've seen the battles, right, to get people into treatment. Of course. And sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but that's just the beginning. When they get to the front door, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. They walk in the front door, and then that's where the real battle begins with the treatment team and the patient and the family. And, you know, if something else you mentioned, if consequences catch people sober, like going through withdrawal once, then everybody would be sober.
That's a really good point, man. Sorry, but that's brilliant. You're right, man. That's very true.
Consequences never keep people sober. And you know, for the person who's suffering from addiction, they still believe that consequences will keep them sober. They don't learn the first time or the second time or the 100th time. I can't tell you how many patients, you know, anecdotally have said to me, well, I know I'm not going to use again because if I do, my wife will divorce me. Mm-hmm. Then I'll usually come back and say, do you think that anyone has gotten divorced due to substance use disorders? Well, yeah. Well, how come the consequences in that scenario didn't prevent them from continuing to use? Or, you know, it's even more severe. Like if I test positive one more time, I'm going to jail for 5 years. Right. I've had patients that knew they were facing severe prison time if they didn't complete a program or they tested dirty again, and they still went out and did it anyway. So that's never going to keep you sober, consequences. What could keep people sober is, you know, advancements in the science, advancements in medication, advancements in treatment, and thinking outside the box. And that's how we're going to get to better treatments and better rates and reduce overdose death.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, you know, it's about the fact that these medications, you know, psychedelic drugs, when used in the right context with the right competent trained clinicians in the right setting, they really have an ability to fast track and catalyze that process, that spiritual transformation or that change that sort of needs to happen in your thinking to where you get out of this pattern. And I think there's a strong argument to be made for the profundity of the experience that psychedelic drugs bring on, particularly in their full dose, because the, I guess, habitual pattern of addiction is so hardwired, depending especially on, you know, how long someone has been using and how long that's been their pattern. It really takes something radical to shake that, you know. And I think what's interesting is that can be psychedelics now. It doesn't have to be the next horrible, you know, DUI or you going to jail or someone dying close to you. Like, it doesn't have to be that causes the disruption, you know. Like, we have medicine now that can have that that can facilitate that disruption and create a place for you. And what's really interesting and important, I think, to point out when talking about things like ibogaine, which is really a hot topic of conversation in the opioid community, is that there is no silver bullet. You know, I don't think either of us are stating that there is, you know, but the fact that these drugs can create basically a window of plasticity. You know, they can create a period of time where you are not in withdrawals anymore, and that pattern has been disrupted. Hopefully you're in a safe place, and now you have this moment where you can make new decisions and you can set new behaviors and form new patterns. And it's all about creating that space, you know, both in treatment and then applying that to our daily lives when you walk outside treatment. You know, how can I create that space between this visceral reaction I have, or this resentment or this pain that I'm having, and my old reaction of reaching for a drug or a substance. If and when, you know, and we're seeing that we're able to use psychedelics to interrupt and modulate that pattern, I think that's where the power really lies, you know. And I think it's important that you kind of bring that up, and that's a really powerful argument for psychedelic medicine in general.
Yeah, I agree. It all comes back to that for me. It's the downstream effects. If we can show and really understand the downstream effects in the brain, and we can show that, you know, it creates, you know, synaptogenesis in the right places, and we can understand what's happening and why, that's where the real holy grail is, I think. because that's the, I don't want to say cure ever, but one of the biggest difficulties with people suffering from substance use disorders, for example, is that the developmental pathways they've created throughout the course of their addiction are rapid fire, incredibly strong. An example would be seeing like a trigger, for example, a trigger that leads to a craving to use. A trigger can be anything, but with IV heroin, for example, a spoon, a needle, a piece of cotton, or anything can be a trigger, which leads to firing of neurons in the brain, which leads to a feeling of desire to use, and which leads to more substance use. If you can find a way to, like you were talking about earlier, kind of change these pathways or disrupt these pathways, or you were mentioning with the case of pain, kind of erase the memories of these pathways in the cells, that might be a little bit far-fetched. But if you can find a way to really do that and quickly, that's what's going to make a major difference. We got to find stuff that works, doesn't take years and years and years, and can have immediate, quick effects.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's so much potential when we look at the various types of addiction and substance use disorders. We've talked a little bit about ibogaine in this episode and its ability to, disrupt opiate withdrawals and cravings, which is really cool. I think another interesting application could be the use of microdosing psychedelics such as LSD or psilocybin. For example, for people recovering from methamphetamine abuse. I think methamphetamine abuse is particularly interesting because these addicts, especially the ones that are unfortunate enough to use for a long time, and God forbid they were IV users, it seems to cause really profound architectural changes in the brain that have by a lot of people considered to be irreversible. But what's so interesting is the potential for neuroplasticity that these psychedelic drugs have the ability to induce. It really changes our definition of what's irreversible. Really anything's possible, right? It seems that we could possibly undo any amount of damage, or at least a very large portion of it. And I think that's really hopeful for the someone in recovery, not just from meth, but I think from meth in particular, there's a lot of anhedonia, and there's a lot of lethargy, and very hard to find motivation because of how badly your dopamine pathways kind of been hijacked, or your reward system. So considering the benefits that Silicon Valley techies have been touting about microdosing for some time now, I think there might be a cool application there, to help people find that creativity and that spark and that drive, through another substance that can be used, with a much safer therapeutic profile and safety profile, and just really responsibly. I think it'd be interesting if you could talk a little bit about, when we were talking about harm reduction and being responsible, like, what's interesting about the traditional psychedelic drugs is that, they kind of have an anti-abuse mechanism intrinsic to them, whether it's something like DMT and the active component ayahuasca, you actually become, it's one of the few compounds I know of that you become increasingly less tolerant to over time. You actually become more sensitive every time you consume ayahuasca or use DMT, which is really unusual. I know kava is like that too, but most drugs are obviously the opposite. And so I think that's super interesting. There's people like Paul Stamets, the famous mycologist, who is doing things like including niacin in his microdosing stack. So the niacin acts as a sort of deterrent, because if you've ever taken too much niacin, you'll have a niacin flush, and that's super uncomfortable. So sort of like anti-abuse mechanisms that are, that they're kind of utilizing as a part of medicalizing these therapies. So just, on a broader topic of harm reduction, like, what do you think is the most important for us to consider? I think this time around in the psychedelic renaissance, we're trying to do a lot of things differently and better than we did in the 60s and 70s. I think everyone's really trying to make sure that we do it right this time. What are some of the things you think needs to happen, especially as this gets integrated into, mental health and addiction and somewhere like where you work?
Yeah, I think a few things. One, what you mentioned was we do have to very carefully examine the potential for abuse for any of these drugs, right? There is some potential for toxicity in repeated administration. We need to know a little bit more about what the potential dangers are there as well. With LSD specifically, some people, and usually from the sample sizes I've found, some people do report fairly severe, significant adverse effects. Common symptoms that they've described: anxiety, fear of going insane, feeling as if one is dying, which is more characterized more commonly in the lay public as a bad trip. That is a risk. It seems like that risk is small, and that risk may be more pronounced in people that have, a history of certain types of anxiety disorders. So that might be a rule out, if you have a family history, and people could be excluded for those kinds of reasons. So we have to examine that much more thoroughly. There's another disorder out there called hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, HPPD, more commonly again known in the lay public as a flashback. But this can involve, kind of intermittent reemergence of the perceptual distortions that are happening during the course of treatment. Sometimes this happens for a few weeks or a few months, and then occasionally people report it goes even longer, even after the drugs have worn off. So I think, as excited as we can get about the potential for significant improvement in very difficult to treat scenarios, the reversal of suicide risk and, bringing down the suicide death rates and reducing withdrawal symptoms, in its tracks. I mean, you mentioned Ibogaine. Ibogaine has actually, some of the studies I've seen have reduced cravings significantly in a very fast time period, 48 hours even. So as much as there is a significant upside and significant potential, we can't lose sight of the fact that some of this may be damaging. They may have, significant side effects that need to be mitigated. We need to understand what type of people are more likely to suffer from these side effects, and make sure we're not, making people worse. But with any drug for any type of health disorder or medical diagnosis, there is some risk of side effects. So if we can get those numbers again down really as low as possible, to a point where it's going to save lives, we have to pour a ton of energy into it. Oh, I hear you.
Oh, perfect. All right, great. We'll just put a note in about the time point. We reconnected at 1:06. Okay, great. So sorry about that, everybody. We had some technical difficulties, but we're reconnected with Dr. Bender now. Do you remember where we left off?
I don't.
I think we were having a really deep discussion about, you know what, maybe I should take a second to think about this. Where did we leave off talking about? The risks.
I was trying to think of that.
The risks.
Oh,
we were
yeah.
talking about the risks. Okay. So 1:06. Okay. Hey, everybody, we're back. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm reconnected with Dr. Bender now. And, we were talking about spotlighting how important it is to talk about the risks. And, okay, we'll do that one more time. Hey, everybody, we're connected again with Dr. Bender. Sorry about those technical difficulties. We were talking about the risks that these medications carry. And granted, they are a lot lower than more traditional drugs we might use, particularly opioids, things like methadone and SSRIs, for example. They definitely have a better toxicity profile. A lot of psychedelics do than some of the drugs we use now. But it's also super important to understand that I think no one is doubting that these are incredibly powerful compounds. And because of that comes a great deal of responsibility that's necessary in properly, safely, and efficaciously integrating them into any sort of treatment protocol. There needs to be a completely revamped or comprehensive process to train the clinicians and the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the therapists that conduct that therapy, and I think that's going to be extra important right now when it comes to implementing these treatments into our modern approach. And I'm just really glad that you brought that up, because that is the most important thing that we're trying to do right this time around, is getting the safety a part of it, down. We're not like Sandoz in the 60s where they were just mailing LSD to anybody and everybody that wanted it. We've come a long way and we've learned a lot since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said that. And agreed. The science has come a long ways since the '60s and Timothy Leary's day. And going forward, like with any drug treatment, it's going to be just as important that we understand the risks, and more importantly, how do we mitigate those risks? The research is it's still in its early phase. There's a lot of work to do. There's been a ton of smaller studies that show very significant and powerful effects. We need to expand upon that. There's pilot studies now showing promise for the treatment of anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, smoking cessation, alcoholism. I mean, how wonderful it would be to have a new type of treatment that showed great improvements in those major areas. But we do need to understand better the physiological mechanisms. We need to continue to work on understanding the downstream effects and the changes in the brain, synaptogenesis, and new neuronal pathways. We have to remember that some of these drugs can create significant side effects. LSD, for one, can create anxiety. They can. We've heard patients and people talk about they sometimes feel like they're going insane or that they're dying, more commonly known as a bad trip. We also know that there is some risk, although we don't know how high a risk, of hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, which again, in this case, more commonly known as a flashback, but it really involves the intermittent reemergence of perceptual distortion, which can sometimes be seen in the following weeks, months, or even longer after these drugs have worn off. So not to mention these things as, to dissuade people from doing this type of research, but it's just like any drug that goes to market, going through the FDA process, there is side effects for potential treatments, and it's about minimizing those side effects. It's about identifying which type of people and type of history with mental illness may experience these side effects more. It's about good screening processes to reduce the impact of those side effects, to help to treat some of these extremely difficult disorders and ultimately save thousands and thousands of lives. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the people of this country and really around the world, that if there is any chance that these types of drugs can be used to do that, then we need to put a ton of resources and get the smartest scientists and researchers involved to figure out the best way to utilize these compounds.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really well said, Dr. Bender, and I appreciate you, spotlighting that important note of caution. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it just got silent for a minute. Let me start over. Yeah, thank you so much for spotlighting the important note of caution here, Dr. Bender. I really appreciate that. It is probably the most important thing moving forward in this space right now. Is making sure we are very mindful of being safe and doing all of this in the best, most efficacious and responsible way possible, because that maximizes the chances of success to everybody, and in the end that benefits society the most. And what's so fascinating and so promising about this new paradigm of treatment is that it seems to be able to benefit so many more people in such a more robust way, I think a way that GDP could eventually increase. There'll be more human innovation. People will be taking less sick days off work. There'll be less overdoses, and less substance abuse. And the staggering healthcare costs in the United States alone is $1 trillion a year, just from between the criminal justice system and medical costs, to society from addiction. So we're really talking about a really big thing here, and it comes at such an important precipice in our collective evolution right now, with the pandemic and mental health crisis and the opioid epidemic. You're at the forefront of all of it, and I think that's just so amazing. I'm really grateful, and I'm sure so many people are, for the work that you do. And as we're closing in on our conversation here, I always like to give my guests the last word. So if you have a message that you'd like to share with our audience, or just a final note to close on, that'd be really awesome.
I used to run a lot of groups for substance use disorder, and I would always tell the patients in those groups one kind of story to kind of get them started, break the ice. But I said, I told them, addiction is a brain disease. We have to treat it like a disease, and we have to use treatments to get to a place of remission, because that's where we're at with addiction right now. There is no cure, but you can put this disease into remission. And I always said to them, one day, I hope that we can sit here in this group and I can hand each one of you a pill and your addiction will be cured and we can all go home. And I jokingly would say, don't worry about me. I'll find another line of work. And, everybody kind of joked and laughed about it, but I was only half kidding. I do truly believe that someday we are going to cure the disease of addiction. I don't know if this is it, or this will be the start of it, or this will, rapidly increase the treatment side of it or not. But I remain hopeful in the face of significant despair. And I hope that I'm alive and around to see it. But it's only going to happen if we start thinking outside the box. We objectively review the data and we explore any possible way of treating these life-ending diseases, regardless of how we feel about it.
Man, that's a really awesome goal, and I think it's a really admirable one, and clearly your passion for working in the space and helping people through these difficult conditions really shines through in the in the way that you speak and the work that you do. And so, I just wanted to say from me and the Microdose team, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I really appreciate having you, and I look forward to our next conversation as usual, Dr. Bender.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And it's always good to talk to you. And feel free to reach out anytime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And everybody, this is another great episode of the PsyFi podcast, where we interview leading industry experts, clinicians, scientists, and researchers to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. I was joined today by Dr. Theodore Bender of UnityPoint. We had a fascinating discussion about addiction, psychedelic medicine, and just the future of mental health in the world right now. And I definitely recommend everybody check it out. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please leave a review, rate us, and check us out next time. Thank you so much, Dr. Bender. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for joining the Psy-Fi series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.